All right, welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive.
Glad to be back.
Today we're going to be tackling a pretty complex and, I think, fascinating figure. We're going to be taking a look at Kim Jong Un
Yeah.
and really diving deep into how his leadership has shaped North Korea, but
Yeah.
also, how it affects the entire world, really, when you think about it.
Absolutely.
So we've got some excerpts from a text called Kim Jong Un, Leadership, Policies, and Global Impact. Really interesting stuff.
Lots to unpack.
Yeah, really kind of lays out, I think, a good neutral view of his leadership from both sides, doesn't really shy away from anything.
Yeah, you see a lot of different perspectives in that text, which I think is really valuable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so one of the first things that jumped out to me in this text is it describes his leadership as being both authoritarian and pragmatic.
Yeah.
And, I mean, I don't know about you, but those seem like kind of contradictory terms to me.
Yeah, right. How do those two things go together?
Exactly. So I was hoping maybe you could help us unpack that a little bit. I mean, how do these seemingly kind of contradictory ideas coexist in the way he leads?
Yeah, it is. It is a bit of a puzzle, isn't it? But I think one way to think about it is that, on the one hand, Kim Jong Un, he's clearly shown that he's willing to consolidate power.
Right.
He really wants to have control over information, control over individual freedoms, things that we in more democratic societies take for granted.
Right, like the free press and things like that.
Exactly, exactly.
Mm.
And, that's a hallmark of authoritarianism, right? That kind of tight grip on power.
Right.
But at the same time, there's this element of pragmatism where it seems like he's willing to bend a little bit, like he's not completely ideologically rigid.
Yeah, and I think the text mentioned this specifically in regard to some of his economic policies and also diplomatic relations with other countries. Like, it's not always black and white.
Right. There's definitely some gray area there. And I think that's what makes him such a fascinating figure to study, because you're never quite sure what he's going to do next.
Absolutely. And speaking of his economic policies, one of the things the document mentions is it talks about limited market-oriented reforms that he's introduced. And to me, that sounds like kind of a risky move,
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think he's hoping to achieve with these reforms? And what are some of the potential risks he's facing?
Yeah, it's definitely a tightrope walk. And I think, at the heart of these reforms is a desire to improve the lives of everyday North Koreans.
So there is a little bit of, I guess, benevolence there, like he's trying to do some good.
I think so, yeah. I mean, the text points to some examples, like in the agricultural sector, where some collective farms are getting a little more autonomy.
Oh, interesting.
And then there's also been, this rise of these informal markets, which the government has kind of been turning a blind eye to.
So it's not like officially sanctioned, but they're just like, well...
Yeah, it's like, we're not going to, crack down on this too hard.
Right. Interesting.
But the potential benefits are pretty clear, right? You could see an improvement in living standards, maybe a little more economic vibrancy. But the flip side of that is that any loosening of control, even in a limited way, it can have unintended consequences.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Because like we were saying earlier, he's got such a tight grip on everything. So any little change could.
Exactly. And it's all about maintaining that balance, right?
Right.
Between giving people a little bit of breathing room, but also not letting things get out of hand.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And, we were talking about his economic policies. And I think obviously a big part of that is the fact that, North Korea is under these pretty intense international sanctions.
Right. That's a huge factor.
I mean, how much of an impact do those sanctions actually have?
Oh, they have a massive impact. I mean, they restrict trade, they restrict investment. It makes it incredibly difficult for North Korea to get the resources it needs to really grow its economy.
Right. I mean, it's almost like they're being punished for, their actions on the world stage. And specifically, when we talk about Kim Jong Un and his leadership, we really can't avoid talking about his nuclear ambitions. I mean, this document really highlights that as just a central focus.
Oh, absolutely. It's a cornerstone of his strategy. I mean, he constantly frames it in terms of national security. He's saying, look, we need these weapons to deter foreign intervention. And when he says foreign intervention, he's really talking about the U.S.
Right, right.
And, the development and testing of intercontinental ballistic missiles, I mean, that's a very clear example of that strategy in action.
It's a pretty bold statement, I guess, when you put it that
Oh,
way.
absolutely. It's a way of projecting power, making a statement on the world stage. It's saying, we're here, we're a force to be reckoned with, don't mess with us.
Don't mess with us.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So I guess then the question becomes, is this, like, focus on military strength hindering the economic progress that he's trying to make with these reforms? Yeah, I think that's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
Right, because on the one hand, he's trying to, boost the economy, improve people's lives. But then on the other hand, he's pouring resources into this nuclear program, which is bringing down all these sanctions.
Right. I mean, it's like he's taking one step forward and two steps back.
Yeah, it's a constant balancing act.
Yeah.
He's trying to project strength, deter threats, but he's also trying to make life better for his people. It's a tough position to be in.
Absolutely. And, it's interesting because the document also points out this kind of really interesting um, contradiction in his leadership.
Hmm.
On one hand, you have these moments of diplomatic engagement. A few years back, he had those summits with Donald Trump.
Right, very high profile.
Very high profile.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, you have this really chilling record of human rights abuses. And one of the things that stood out to me in the document was this mention of a hostile class.
Hmm.
Can you explain what that is? And how does that kind of fit into this whole picture?
Yeah, so the hostile class is this term that the North Korean regime uses. Basically, it's how they categorize individuals and families that they perceive as threats to the state.
Oh, wow.
And it can be really broad. It can include people who have family ties to South Korea, people who've criticized the government.
So basically anyone they deem as a threat.
Exactly. And if you're labeled as part of the hostile class, you can be subject to surveillance, discrimination, and even imprisonment in labor camps.
I mean, that's terrifying.
Yeah, it's a very dark side to the regime. And it's something that's often overlooked when we focus on, the nuclear weapons or the summits.
Right.
It's important to remember the human cost of all of this.
For sure. It's like this really stark contrast. On the one hand, he's having these diplomatic talks, but on the other hand, there's this kind of reign of terror happening within his own country.
Absolutely.
So I guess given all of these contradictions that we've been talking about, the authoritarianism alongside pragmatism, the economic reforms alongside these nuclear ambitions, the diplomacy alongside human rights abuses. I mean, what's your take on Kim Jong Un's leadership overall? I mean, how do you make sense of it all?
It's tough, isn't it? It's such a complex picture. And honestly, it's hard to say what direction he's ultimately going to take North Korea in.
Yeah. I mean, it feels like every time you think you got him figured out, he does something that throws you for a loop.
Exactly. And, he's still relatively young. The geopolitical landscape is constantly shifting. There are all these pressures within North Korea itself.
Yeah.
So it really is anyone's guess whether his pragmatism will lead to genuine lasting change or if it's just a way of propping up the existing system.
Right. Yeah, it's a big question mark.
It is.
Well, you've definitely given us a lot to think about today. I think this document and our conversation has really painted a pretty vivid picture of Kim Jong Un's leadership. And it's clear that understanding North Korea, it requires, kind of looking beyond the headlines.
Right.
And really grappling with these complexities and these contradictions.
And I think it's something we all need to do more of, right? Because it's easy to simplify things, to see things in black and white.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But the reality is much more nuanced than that.
Yeah. And so I guess the question is, going forward, what does the future hold for Kim Jong Un? What does the future hold for North Korea? What does the future hold for its relationship with the rest of the world?
It's the question we're all asking, right? And I think this deep dive has given us a good foundation to start exploring that further.
Absolutely. So for all of you listening out there, if you're interested in learning more about this, I mean, there are tons of resources available. This is just kind of scratching the surface.
Yeah, do some digging. You won't be disappointed. There's so much out there.
Definitely a lot to uncover. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.
Take care.
Bye.